The dust cloud appeared on the horizon just after noon, growing larger against the pale October sky of Dakota Territory. Captain William Hayes squinted through his field glasses, counting the riders approaching Clearwater Springs. 12 cavalry soldiers, their blue uniforms faded and trail-worn, escorted a lone figure on horseback, a woman with long, dark braids that caught the autumn sunlight. James Kane paused in loading supplies onto his wagon, his weathered hands gripping the rope as he watched the procession. Something about the scene unsettled him, though he couldn't name what. The woman rode straight-backed, dignified, but her hands were bound to the saddle horn. Not a rescued captive, then. A prisoner. The townspeople began gathering along Main Street, drawn by the commotion. Shopkeepers emerged from their stores, women clutched their shawls tighter, and children pressed against their mothers' skirts. Word spread quickly through Clearwater Springs. The cavalry had recovered a white woman from the Lakota. "Thank the Lord," whispered Mrs. Patterson, the baker's wife. "Another soul saved from those savages." James frowned at her words, but said nothing. He'd learned to keep his opinions to himself in this town, especially opinions that didn't align with the popular sentiment about the local tribes. Captain Hayes dismounted in front of the mayor's office, his spurs jingling against the wooden planks. The woman, she couldn't be more than 22, remained mounted, her dark eyes scanning the crowd with a mixture of defiance and wariness. Her clothes were unmistakably Lakota, a beautifully beaded doe-skin dress, soft moccasins and intricate bone jewelry at her throat. Mayor Cornelius Whitman emerged from his office, his considerable belly straining against his vest buttons. "Captain Hayes, we received your telegram. This is the Mitchell woman?" "Sarah Mitchell, yes, sir," Hayes replied, removing his hat to wipe the sweat from his brow. "Found her living with Chief Running Bear's band, about 60 miles north. She's been with them for 15 years, since she was captured as a child." Whitman studied Sarah with undisguised distaste. "Good God, look at her, dressed like one of them, hair braided in their heathen fashion. What has she become?" Sarah's jaw tightened, but she said nothing. When Hayes moved to help her dismount, she spoke for the first time, her voice clear and strong. "I can manage myself." The accent was there, unmistakably English, but beneath it lay something else, a cadence that spoke of long years among people who weren't these gathered townspeople. "She speaks English, at least," Whitman muttered, "though Lord knows what other habits she's picked up." Emma Caldwell, the town's schoolteacher, pushed through the crowd. A woman of 30 with kind eyes and practical dress, she alone seemed to look at Sarah with something approaching compassion. She must be exhausted. "When did you last eat, dear?" Sarah's gaze met Emma's, and for a moment, something vulnerable flickered in her expression. "This morning. We shared jerky and water." "We?" Whitman's voice sharpened. "You mean those savages who held you captive?" "I mean my family," Sarah replied quietly, and the words fell like stones into still water. The crowd stirred uneasily. This wasn't the grateful, traumatized victim they'd expected. This was a woman who spoke of her captors as family, who wore their clothes with pride, who showed no relief at her rescue. James found himself studying her face, noting the strength in her features, the way she held herself, despite being bound and surrounded by hostile strangers. 15 years among the Lakota had shaped her into something the people of Clearwater Springs couldn't understand, and therefore couldn't accept. "Captain," Whitman said, his voice carrying the authority of his office, "we'll need to discuss arrangements for rehabilitation. Clearly, this woman has been deeply influenced by her captivity. It will take considerable effort to restore her to civilized society." Sarah's eyes flashed with anger, but she remained silent, her bound hands clenched into fists. As the crowd began to disperse, murmuring among themselves about the strange woman who called savages her family, James lingered. Something told him that Sarah Mitchell's real trials were just beginning, and that her rescue might prove to be another kind of captivity altogether. 3 days had passed since Sarah's arrival, and the town council had reached their decision. The morning sun cast long shadows across the town square as Mayor Whitman stood on the steps of the courthouse, a pair of iron shears glinting in his meaty hands. "Citizens of Clearwater Springs," his voice boomed across the gathered crowd, "we are here today to witness the first step in reclaiming one of our own from the savage influences that have corrupted her soul." Sarah stood in the center of the square, her hands now unbound but flanked by 2 burly men who served as the town's unofficial enforcers. She'd been given a plain brown dress to wear, proper Christian attire, Mrs. Patterson had called it, but her beautiful braids still hung down her back, adorned with small feathers and beads that caught the morning light. James Kane positioned himself near the back of the crowd, his hat pulled low over his eyes. The sight of the shears in Whitman's hands made his stomach turn. He'd seen enough cruelty in his years as a soldier, but this felt different, calculated, performed for the entertainment of decent people. The savage custom of long hair, braided with heathen ornaments, is a symbol of everything we must purge from this woman's soul, Whitman continued, his voice growing more theatrical. By cutting away these external marks of barbarism, we begin her journey back to civilization. Emma Caldwell stood with her hands pressed to her mouth, her face pale with horror. She'd tried to intervene, had even gone to the sheriff, but the law was on Whitman's side. Sarah was considered a ward of the town, until proper arrangements could be made. Sarah herself stood perfectly still, her dark eyes fixed on some distant point beyond the crowd. She showed no emotion, no fear, but James could see the slight tremor in her hands, the way her jaw clenched as Whitman approached. "Miss Mitchell," Whitman said, his tone falsely gentle, "this may seem harsh, but it is necessary. Your hair is a symbol of your captivity, of the unnatural life you've been forced to live. Today we set you free." For the first time, Sarah spoke. Her voice was steady, clear, and carried across the square. "My hair is a symbol of my heritage. My mother, my Lakota mother, taught me to braid it with prayers for my family, for the people I love. You are not setting me free. You are taking away the last piece of who I am." The crowd murmured uneasily at her words. This wasn't the grateful compliance they'd expected. "You see," Whitman addressed the crowd, "the corruption runs deep. She speaks of savages as family, of heathen rituals as sacred. This is precisely why such drastic measures are necessary." He grasped the first braid, thick and lustrous, woven with small bones and blue beads. The shears bit through the hair with a sharp, metallic sound that seemed to echo in the sudden silence. Sarah's composure cracked for just a moment, a sharp intake of breath, a flutter of her eyelids, before she regained control. But James saw it, saw the way her spirit seemed to diminish with each falling strand. Whitman worked methodically, cutting close to her scalp, letting each severed braid fall to the dusty ground. The crowd watched in fascination and horror as Sarah's beautiful hair that had grown for 15 years, hair that told the story of her life among the Lakota, was reduced to a ragged, uneven crop. When it was finished, Sarah stood shorn and trembling, her hands instinctively reaching for braids that were no longer there. The beads and feathers lay scattered in the dirt around her feet, like fallen stars. "There," Whitman announced with satisfaction, "the first step toward redemption." As the crowd began to disperse, chattering excitedly about the morning's spectacle, James lingered. When no one was looking, he knelt and began gathering the fallen hair, each beautiful braid, each scattered bead. His calloused hands were gentle as he collected the pieces of Sarah's identity that lay trampled in the dust. Working quietly, he gathered the longest strands together, weaving them carefully into a single thick braid. At the end, he tied it with a small piece of rawhide from his vest, creating a bow, a simple but profound gesture of preservation and respect. Sarah, being led away by Emma Caldwell, glanced back and saw him there, kneeling in the dirt, treating her discarded hair with more reverence than the townspeople had shown her entire being. Their eyes met across the square, and something passed between them, an understanding, a recognition of shared humanity in a place that seemed to have forgotten what that meant. James tucked the braided bow carefully into his saddlebags, a silent promise that some things were too sacred to be destroyed, even by the cruelest intentions. 2 weeks had passed since the hair-cutting ceremony, and Sarah felt like a ghost haunting her own life. Emma Caldwell had taken her in, providing a small room above the schoolhouse where Sarah spent her days, staring out the window at the vast prairie that stretched toward the horizon, toward home. The townspeople watched her constantly. Every trip to the general store, every walk to the well, every moment she spent in public was scrutinized for signs of savage behavior. When she instinctively reached for her missing braids, Mrs. Patterson would click her tongue disapprovingly. When she sat cross-legged on the floor instead of in a chair, the children would whisper and point. "You must try to fit in," Emma urged gently one evening as they sat in the small parlor. "I know it's difficult, but fighting them will only make things worse." Sarah touched the uneven stubble of her hair, now growing out in awkward tufts. In the Lakota way, a woman's hair holds her power, her connection to the spirits of her ancestors. "They didn't just cut my hair, Emma. They cut away my soul." Emma's eyes filled with tears. "I'm so sorry, Sarah. What they did was cruel and wrong. But you're still you. underneath it all. Am I? Sarah's voice was barely a whisper. I don't know who I am anymore. I'm not white enough for this world, and now I'm not Lakota enough for my own. Outside, the October wind howled through the streets, carrying with it the scent of coming winter. Sarah shivered, remembering how her Lakota mother would have been preparing the lodge for the cold months, storing meat and gathering medicinal herbs. Here, she was trapped in a world of walls and windows, suffocating on the expectations of people who saw her as nothing more than a project to be fixed. The next morning, as Sarah helped Emma prepare the schoolhouse for the day's lessons, she noticed a figure across the street. James Kane stood beside his wagon, loading supplies, but his eyes kept drifting toward the schoolhouse. When their gazes met, he touched the brim of his hat in a small gesture of acknowledgement. "That's James Kane," Emma said, following Sarah's gaze. "He's a good man, though he keeps to himself. Lost his wife and child to scarlet fever a few years back, been drifting ever since." Sarah watched as James finished loading his wagon. There was something about the way he moved, the quiet dignity in his posture, that reminded her of the Lakota warriors she'd grown up with. He possessed that same self-contained strength, that same careful awareness of his surroundings. As if sensing her thoughts, James crossed the street and approached the schoolhouse. He removed his hat, revealing hair the color of autumn wheat, and spoke in a low, respectful voice. "Morning, Miss Caldwell. Miss Mitchell." He nodded to each woman in turn. "I was wondering if I might have a word with Miss Mitchell, if that's acceptable." Emma glanced at Sarah, who nodded slightly. "Of course, Mr. Kane. Sarah, I'll be inside preparing the lessons." When they were alone, James reached into his vest pocket and withdrew something wrapped in soft leather. "I wanted to return this to you," he said simply. Sarah's breath caught as she recognized the shape. With trembling hands, she unwrapped the leather to reveal her hair, carefully braided and tied with a small bow. The beads and feathers had been painstakingly woven back in, each one in its proper place. "I thought you might want it back," James said quietly. "Seemed wrong to leave it in the dirt." Tears spilled down Sarah's cheeks as she held the braid, the last tangible piece of her life with the Lakota. "Why?" she whispered. "Why would you do this for me?" James was quiet for a long moment, his blue eyes studying her face. "Because I've seen what happens when people try to erase who you are. I spent 3 years in the war, watching good men lose themselves to hatred and fear. I won't stand by and watch it happen to you." "But you don't even know me." "I know enough," he said firmly. "I know you're not the broken victim they want you to be. I know you're fighting to hold on to something precious, and I respect that fight." Sarah clutched the braid to her chest, feeling for the first time in weeks like she could breathe. "The people here, they want me to forget. They want me to be ashamed of who I became, of the family that raised me." "Then they don't understand what family really means," James replied. "Family isn't just blood, Miss Mitchell. It's the people who shape your heart, who teach you how to be strong. Nobody has the right to take that away from you." As he turned to leave, Sarah called out softly, "James?" He paused, glancing back. "Thank you for seeing me as more than a project to be fixed." He touched his hat brim again, a ghost of a smile crossing his weathered features. "Take care of yourself, Sarah, and remember, they can cut your hair, but they can't cut your spirit, not unless you let them." That night, Sarah sat by her window, holding the braided bow and watching the stars emerge over the prairie. For the first time since her rescue, she felt a flicker of hope. Perhaps she wasn't as alone as she'd thought. Perhaps there were still people in this world who understood that some things were too sacred to be destroyed. The war party appeared at dawn, 12 Lakota warriors mounted on painted horses, their silhouettes stark against the pale November sky. James saw them first from his camp outside town, where he'd been preparing for another day of hauling supplies to the nearby ranches. The sight of them made his blood run cold, not from fear, but from the knowledge of what was about to unfold. Chief Running Bear rode at the center of the group, his weathered face set in grim determination. Even from a distance, James could see the eagle feathers in his hair, the war paint streaked across his cheeks, the rifle resting across his saddle. This was not a man who had come to negotiate. The church bell began tolling frantically as the first townsperson spotted the riders. Within minutes, Clearwater Springs was in chaos. Women screamed and gathered their children, men grabbed rifles and barricaded themselves in buildings, and Mayor Whitman could be heard shouting orders that nobody seemed to follow. James spurred his horse toward town, his mind racing. He'd seen enough warfare to know that panic would only make things worse. As he reached Main Street, he saw Sheriff Morrison trying to organize the men into a defensive line, but their hands shook as they held their weapons. "They're here for the woman," Morrison called out. "The Mitchell girl. They've come to take her back." Through the window of the schoolhouse, James could see Sarah's face, pale but resolute. She'd heard the commotion, had seen the riders, and she knew exactly who they were. Emma Caldwell stood beside her, one protective hand on Sarah's shoulder. The Lakota warriors stopped just outside the town limits, their horses dancing nervously in the cold morning air. Chief Running Bear raised his hand, and the terrible silence that followed was broken only by the sound of wind through the buildings and the distant crying of a child. "I am Running Bear of the Lakota," his voice carried clearly across the space between them, spoken in accented but perfect English. "I have come for my daughter Winona, who was taken from our people by your soldiers." Mayor Whitman stepped forward, his considerable bulk shaking with either fear or rage. "That woman is Sarah Mitchell, a white citizen of the United States. She was rescued from captivity and is under our protection." "Protection?" Running Bear's laugh was bitter. "You cut her hair like she was a criminal. You dress her in your clothes and try to make her forget who she is. This is not protection. This is another kind of slavery." James found himself moving closer to the schoolhouse, drawn by an instinct he couldn't name. Through the window, he could see Sarah pressing her face against the glass, her eyes locked on the man who had clearly been more father to her than any blood relation. "She was stolen from us as a child," Whitman insisted, his voice growing shrill. "We're helping her remember her true heritage, her Christian upbringing." "Her true heritage?" Running Bear dismounted, his movements fluid and controlled. "For 15 winters she was my daughter. I taught her to ride, to hunt, to know the songs of our people. I held her when she cried for the white family she barely remembered, and I loved her as my own child. You speak of theft, white man, but who is the thief here?" The standoff stretched taut as a bowstring. James could see the townspeople's fingers tightening on their weapons, could feel the violence building in the air like a thunderstorm. One wrong move, one frightened shot, and this would become a massacre. That's when Sarah made her choice. The schoolhouse door opened with a bang, and she walked out into the street, her chin raised defiantly. Emma tried to stop her, but Sarah gently pulled free from her grasp. "Father," she called out in Lakota, her voice carrying across the tense silence. "You came for me." Running Bear's stern expression softened as he looked at his adopted daughter. "My child, what have they done to you?" Sarah touched her shorn hair, then squared her shoulders. "They tried to make me forget who I am, but I remember everything. Every story you told me, every lesson you taught me, every moment of love you gave me. Then come home, Winona. Come back to your people." The crowd stirred restlessly. Whitman stepped forward, his face red with anger. "You're not going anywhere, Miss Mitchell. You're under the protection of this town, and these savages have no legal claim on you." "Legal claim?" Sarah's voice rose, filled with a fury that had been building for weeks. "What legal claim did you have to cut my hair? What legal claim did you have to dress me like a doll and parade me around as your success story? I am not your property, Mayor Whitman. I am not your trophy to be displayed." James stepped into the street, his hand resting on his gun but not drawing it. "Let her choose," he said quietly, his voice somehow carrying in the stillness. "Let her decide where she belongs." All eyes turned to him, the townspeople surprised by his intervention, the Lakota warriors assessing this new player in their drama. But James kept his gaze fixed on Sarah, seeing in her face the same struggle he'd fought in his own life, the choice between what others expected and what his heart demanded. "This is none of your business, Kane," Whitman snarled. "Stand down." "It became my business the day you cut her hair in the town square," James replied, his voice steady but carrying an edge of steel. "I've seen enough cruelty in my lifetime. I won't stand by and watch more." Running Bear studied James with intelligent eyes. "You are the one who saved her hair," he said, not asking but stating a fact. "My daughter told me of your kindness in her dreams." The moment stretched between them all, Sarah in the middle, torn between two worlds, two families, two ways of life. The choice she made now would determine not just her future, but the fate of everyone standing in that dusty street, poised on the knife's edge between peace and war. The wind picked up, swirling dust between the two opposing sides, as Sarah stood in the center of the street, the weight of everyone's expectations pressing down on her shoulders. She could feel the eyes of the townspeople boring into her back, could see the hope and pain in Running Bear's weathered face, could sense James's quiet strength supporting her from the sidelines. "I have spent 3 weeks in this town," Sarah said, her voice carrying clearly in the cold air. 3 weeks being told that everything I am is wrong, that everyone I love is savage, that my very thoughts and feelings are corrupted by my time with the Lakota. Mayor Whitman stepped forward eagerly. Yes, and we've been working to heal that corruption, to restore you to what? Sarah's eyes flashed with anger. To a life I barely remember, to a family that was torn from me when I was 7 years old. You speak of rescue, Mayor, but I was not a prisoner among the Lakota. I was a daughter, a sister, a valued member of a family that loved me for who I was, not who they wanted me to become. She turned to face Running Bear, speaking in Lakota, her voice thick with emotion. My father, my heart breaks to leave you, but I cannot come home. Not yet. The old chief's face tightened with pain, but he nodded slowly. Tell me why, my daughter. Sarah switched back to English, ensuring everyone could understand. Because if I leave with you now, nothing changes. The people of this town will continue to believe that white children who live among native peoples are victims to be rescued. They will continue to tear families apart, to cut hair and destroy identities in the name of civilization. She walked slowly toward the crowd of townspeople, her head high despite her shorn hair. But if I stay, if I show you that I can be both, that I can honor my white heritage while treasuring my Lakota family, perhaps some of you will begin to understand that love doesn't recognize the color of skin, and family is more than the accident of birth. You're making a mistake, Whitman said, his voice harsh. These people will never accept you as you are. They're savages, and association with them will only bring you pain. The only savages I've encountered, Sarah replied quietly, are the ones who cut a woman's hair in a public square to humiliate her into submission. James stepped forward, his eyes meeting Sarah's. If you stay, you won't be alone. I give you my word on that. Running Bear dismounted and walked slowly toward his adopted daughter. When he reached her, he placed his hands gently on her shoulders. You have grown wise, Winona. Wiser than this old man who thought only of his own grief at losing you. From beneath his elk-hide shirt, he drew out a small leather pouch. Your mother, your Lakota mother. She made this for you before the fever took her. She said it would protect you on whatever path you chose to walk. Sarah opened the pouch with trembling hands. Inside was a small silver locket, clearly a white woman's jewelry, strung on a cord of braided sweetgrass. She kept this? She said it belonged to your first mother, the one who gave you life. She wanted you to carry both mothers' love with you, always. Running Bear's voice was gentle. She would be proud of the choice you make today. Sarah fastened the locket around her neck, the silver catching the pale sunlight. In that moment, she truly was, both, white and Lakota, daughter of two worlds, belonging fully to neither, but carrying the love of both. I will visit, she promised Running Bear. When the snows melt and the prairie grass grows green again, I will come to see you. And I will be waiting, the old chief replied. But know this, you will always be welcome in my lodge, always be my daughter, no matter what path you choose. As the Lakota warriors prepared to leave, Emma Caldwell appeared at Sarah's side. You can stay with me for as long as you need, she said softly, and I'll help you teach these people that different doesn't mean dangerous. James approached slowly, his hat in his hands. I meant what I said about not being alone. I've got a small spread about 5 miles out of town. It's not much, but it's peaceful. You'd be welcome there, if you ever need a place where you can just be yourself. Sarah looked at the braided bow of hair he'd returned to her, then at the locket resting against her heart. I think I'd like that, she said. Both worlds, both families. Maybe it's time I stopped trying to choose between them and started building bridges instead. As the dust settled and the Lakota warriors disappeared into the vast prairie, Sarah stood in the street of Clearwater Springs, no longer the frightened woman who had arrived a month ago. She was something new, a bridge between worlds, a living testament to the power of love over fear, of understanding over prejudice. The townspeople dispersed slowly, murmuring among themselves. Some looked troubled, others thoughtful. Change would come slowly to Clearwater Springs, but it would come, and Sarah Mitchell, Winona of the Lakota, would be there to guide it, carrying the love of two mothers and the wisdom of two worlds in her heart. The wind carried the scent of winter and the promise of spring, and for the first time since her arrival, Sarah smiled.